December 8th, 1941, Tokyo. The mood in the imperial capital was electric. It was a euphoria that the Japanese people had never felt before and would never feel again. The radio speakers on every street corner crackled with the Gunkan Koshinkyoku, the warship march. The announcers screaming the news that seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. The American Pacific Fleet and the mighty dragons of the sea lay broken and burning at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. In the Ministry of War, champagne corks were popping. Generals slapped each other on the back. The plan had worked. The gamble had paid off. The Empire of Japan had struck the first blow, and it was a knockout. To the military hardliners, the path forward seemed destined by the gods themselves. They looked at the map of the Pacific, and they didn't see obstacles. They saw stepping stones: the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Hawaii, and beyond Hawaii, the west coast of the United States. California lay wide open. Panic was gripping Los Angeles and San Francisco. There were rumors of Japanese submarines surfacing off the coast, like of invasion fleets gathering in the mist. The door to the American mainland was unlocked, and the Japanese Imperial Army was standing on the threshold. But inside the heavily guarded walls of the Imperial General Headquarters, there was one man who was not celebrating. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat at his desk, his face a mask of stone. He was the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. He was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. He was the hero of the hour. Yet, while his subordinates drank sake and toasted to the emperor, Yamamoto was writing in his diary, his hand heavy with a terrifying realization. He knew something that the generals in the army did not. You see, Yamamoto was a paradox. He was a samurai spirit with a Western mind. He had not just studied the United States from afar. He had lived there. He had studied at Harvard University. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. He had driven his car across the vast, empty stretches of the American Midwest. He had stayed in motels in Kansas. He had gambled in the parlors of Nevada, and he had walked through the smoke-filled factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh. He had seen the scale of the beast. He knew that what happened at Pearl Harbor was not a victory. It was a poke in the eye of a sleeping dragon. While the politicians in Tokyo spoke of American weakness, calling them soft, decadent, and materialistic, Yamamoto remembered the men he had met in the Texas oil fields. He remembered the steel workers in Pennsylvania. He remembered the stubborn, independent spirit of the farmers he saw in the fields. So, when the whispers began in the high command, when the ambitious young officers pointed their fingers at the map of North America and asked, why stop? Why not invade? Why not march on Washington and dictate the peace terms in the White House? Yamamoto had to be the one to shatter the illusion. He looked at them, and he laid out a reality so brutal, so cold, that it chilled the room. He didn't talk about naval tonnage. He didn't talk about fuel reserves. He talked about a mathematical impossibility. He warned them that invading America was a suicide pact, not because the American army was too strong. At that moment, the American army was barely larger than the army of Portugal. No. Yamamoto feared something else. He feared the geography, he feared the industry, and most of all, he feared the population. He is famously rumored to have said, "You cannot invade the mainland United States. There would be a rifle behind every blade of grass." Think about what that means. A rifle behind every blade of grass. It wasn't just a poetic warning. It was a prophecy. It was the recognition that America was not just a country. It was a fortress built by nature and defended by 50 million armed civilians who would turn every farm into a sniper's nest and every town into a graveyard. This is the story of that warning. This is the story of the 4 impossible barriers that stood between the Empire of Japan and the United States, and it is the story of why, even as the smoke was still rising from Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto knew that the war was already lost. To truly grasp the magnitude of the terrifying realization that gripped Admiral Yamamoto, we must peel back the layers of history and look deep into the soul of the two nations that were about to collide. Because the phrase, "a rifle behind every blade of grass," was not merely a warning about weapons. It was a warning about the fundamental DNA of the American people, which was diametrically opposed to everything the Imperial Japanese High Command understood about warfare and society. In the Japan of 1941, the social structure was built upon centuries of rigid hierarchy and absolute obedience. A structure solidified during the Great Sword Hunt of the late 16th century, when Toyotomi Hideyoshi ruthlessly disarmed the peasantry to ensure that only the samurai class held the power of violence. For over 300 years, the average Japanese citizen had been conditioned to believe that weapons belonged to the state, that protection was the duty of the emperor, and that resistance against authority was not just futile but morally wrong. To the generals sitting in the war room in Tokyo, war was a chess game played between professional armies. When the king falls and the pawns surrender, when the capital is taken, the population bows. This was the logic they applied to China, to Korea, and now to the United States. But Yamamoto, the man who had spent years living among the Americans, who had immersed himself in their culture, knew that applying Japanese logic to the American mainland was a fatal error. He tried to convey to his superiors the shock he felt when he first traveled through the American Midwest and saw the hardware stores in small towns like Des Moines or Omaha. He wasn't just looking at inventory, and he was looking at an arsenal distributed among the populace. He described walking into general stores where high-powered Winchester rifles, shotguns capable of taking down large game, and thousands of rounds of ammunition were stacked casually next to farming equipment and bags of flour, available to anyone with a handful of dollars. He saw teenagers practicing marksmanship in open fields, not as soldiers in training, but as a rite of passage. A father teaching his son how to shoot a deer at 300 yards with lethal precision. This was the gun culture that the Japanese high command dismissed as barbarism, but Yamamoto recognized it as the world's largest dormant guerrilla army. The intelligence estimates were staggering. In a nation of 130 million people, there were estimated to be over 50 million privately owned firearms, a number that dwarfed the entire stockpile of the Imperial Japanese Army. Yamamoto forced the generals to visualize the nightmare scenario of an invasion, painting a picture so bleak that it bordered on horror. Imagine, he argued, that our troops successfully storm the beaches of California. Imagine we defeat the U.S. Marines and push inland, like what happens next in China. When we take a village, the peasants hide or flee, but in America, there is no rear area. There is no safe zone. Every single farmhouse is a potential pillbox. Every barn loft is a sniper's nest. Every stand of trees overlooking a supply road conceals a man who knows the terrain, who has hunted in those woods his entire life, and who owns a rifle that can blow the head off an officer from half a mile away. The Japanese soldier, trained for formatted battles, for banzai charges, and for fighting other uniformed men, would be psychologically broken by an enemy he could not see, an enemy who wore denim overalls instead of a uniform, an enemy who struck from the shadows and melted back into the cornfields. It would be a war of attrition on a scale never seen in human history. Yamamoto explained that the United States was born in revolution, forged by men who owned their own weapons and used them to overthrow the greatest empire on earth, the British. That spirit, that don't tread on me individualism, was not just history to the Americans, it was a religion. If the Imperial Army occupied a town, they wouldn't just be policing a conquered population, they would be sitting on a powder keg. Supply trucks would be ambushed by local mechanics, officers would be assassinated by high school teachers, communication lines would be cut by farmers. The occupation force would need to be larger than the invasion force to hold a country the size of the United States. Against a population armed to the teeth, Japan would need millions of soldiers just to keep the roads open. It was a logistical and tactical impossibility. Yamamoto asked his colleagues a simple question: are you prepared to fight a war where there is no front line, where the enemy is everyone, where even if you capture Washington, D.C., the war does not end because the government is not the source of the people's power? The people are the source of the government's power? This was the concept of the rifle behind every blade of grass. It wasn't about the grass, and it was about the impossibility of subjugation. He argued that unlike the subjects of the emperor who fought for duty, the American civilian would fight for something far more dangerous: property, home, and individual liberty. There is no breaking point for a man defending his own front porch. You can bomb a city into submission, but you cannot bomb a man out of his own house without destroying the very prize you seek to capture. Yamamoto knew that the vastness of the American landscape, combined with this armed populace, meant that any invasion force would simply be swallowed up, digested, and destroyed by the land itself. While the victory disease made the army generals dream of marching on the White House, Yamamoto saw the reality. an endless graveyard for Japanese soldiers stretching from the Sierra Nevada to the Mississippi River. He knew that the very thing the Japanese despised about Americans, their chaotic, individualistic, gun-toting nature, was actually their ultimate defense, an unwritten, chaotic, but impenetrable shield that no professional army could ever hope to break. This was the secret that kept Yamamoto awake at night, the knowledge that he had poked a dragon that didn't just have sharp teeth, but had 50 million scales, and every single scale was a weapon waiting to be used. If the 50 million rifles in the hands of American civilians represented a wall of fire, then the North American continent itself represented a wall of ice and granite that was mathematically impossible to scale, because Yamamoto knew that war is not merely about fighting spirit or the clash of swords. War is about logistics. It is about the boring, unsexy, yet brutal reality of moving tons of steel and food from point A to point B. And when he looked at the map of a hypothetical invasion, he didn't see a battlefield, he saw gaps. He saw a graveyard. To understand the sheer lunacy of invading the United States, we must look at the tyranny of distance. The generals in Tokyo were accustomed to fighting in East Asia, where supply lines were relatively short and the terrain, while difficult, was manageable. But America was a monster of geography. The first hurdle was the Pacific Ocean itself, a 5,000-mile moat that protected the West Coast. An invading army moves on its stomach, and it fights with its ammunition. Every single bullet, every bag of rice, every gallon of gasoline for the tanks, and every bandage for the wounded would have to be shipped from Japan across the largest body of water on Earth. Yamamoto knew the Imperial Navy did not have the shipping tonnage to support such a massive lifeline. He knew that American submarines, the silent hunters of the deep, would turn that supply route into a highway of death, sinking transport ships faster than Japan could build them. But let's assume, for the sake of this terrifying thought experiment, that the Japanese army somehow miraculously crosses the ocean and establishes a beachhead in California. What awaits them is not the rolling plains of Europe, but the geography of hell. First, they would face the coastal ranges, a rugged spine of mountains that turns the coastline into a fortress. But beyond that lies the true monster, the Sierra Nevada. Yamamoto had driven past these mountains. He knew them. They are a solid wall of granite rising 14,000 feet into the air. There are only a few passes through them, narrow, twisting roads and rail lines that are easily blocked by a handful of defenders. A few American engineers with dynamite could blow up the tunnels and bridges at the Donner Pass. And suddenly, the entire invading army is trapped on the coast and staring up at an unclimbable wall while the American Air Force rains fire down upon them. And if they somehow breach the Sierras, they would not enter the Promised Land. They would enter the Great Basin, the deserts of Nevada and Utah. This is a landscape that has killed travelers for centuries. It is hundreds of miles of scorching heat, alkali dust, and absolutely no water. Imagine a Japanese tank column, designed for the jungles of Malaya, trying to cross the Mojave Desert in July. The engines would overheat and seize. The treads would snap on the jagged rocks. The soldiers, and unaccustomed to the arid climate, would drop from heat stroke by the thousands. There is no food here to scavenge. There are no fields to plunder. They would be entirely dependent on that 5,000-mile supply line back to Tokyo, a line that would be getting thinner and weaker with every mile they advanced. And then, after surviving the desert, they would hit the final boss of North American geography, the Rocky Mountains. This is the Continental Divide. It is higher, colder, and more rugged than the Sierras. It is a fortress designed by nature to stop empires in their tracks. By the time a Japanese army reached the Rockies, they would be thousands of miles from their supply base, starving, freezing, and running on empty. And all the while, the Americans would be fighting on their home turf. They would use the vast network of U.S. railroads, the finest in the world, to move entire armies from the East Coast to the front lines in days. They would have interior lines of communication, shifting forces at will, while the invaders were paralyzed by the terrain. Yamamoto understood the scale of America in a way his colleagues did not, because he had felt it beneath the tires of his car. He knew that you could drive for days in America and see nothing but wheat fields and mountains, He knew that the sheer size of the country was a weapon in itself. To occupy a nation that spans an entire continent, you don't just need soldiers. You need millions of occupiers just to guard the supply routes. You need an ocean of gasoline that Japan simply did not possess. In fact, Japan's entire war strategy was driven by a lack of oil. They went to war to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies because they were running on fumes. To think that this resource-starved island nation could project power across an ocean, cross two mountain ranges, and a desert to conquer a continent overflowing with oil and steel was not just optimistic. It was delusional. It was a logistical fantasy that ignored the laws of physics. Yamamoto looked at the map and saw what Napoleon saw in Russia, but on a vastly larger scale. He saw an army being swallowed by the land, and he stretched until it snapped, and then devoured by the winter and the partisans. He knew that the United States didn't even need to defeat the Japanese army in a pitched battle to win. All they had to do was blow the bridges, block the tunnels, and wait. General Winter and General Distance would do the rest. The land itself was American, and it would fight for its people. This was the second impossibility, and the realization that before you can conquer the American people, that you have to conquer the North American continent. And that is a feat that no army in the history of mankind has ever achieved. But even if the Japanese army could somehow survive the 50 million rifles in the hands of the citizenry, and even if they could miraculously navigate the logistical nightmare of crossing the Rocky Mountains, they would ultimately crash against the third, and perhaps the most insurmountable wall of all, the American arsenal of democracy. This was the giant that Yamamoto truly feared. While the army generals in Tokyo were obsessed with the spirit of the warrior and the mystical power of the emperor, Yamamoto was looking at a different kind of power, the power of the assembly line. He had toured the automobile factories of Detroit. He had seen the steel mills of Pittsburgh glowing red in the night. He understood that modern war is not a duel between samurai. It is a battle of industrial attrition, a contest of steel, oil, and aluminum. And in this contest, the Empire of Japan was bringing a knife to a gunfight. The numbers were not just bad, they were catastrophic. In 1941, the United States was producing nearly half of the world's steel, the very skeleton of any war machine. Japan produced less than 10% of that amount, but the disparity in oil, the lifeblood of modern mechanized warfare, was even more terrifying. The United States was the Saudi Arabia of the 1940s, pumping over 60% of the world's crude oil from its own soil in Texas, Oklahoma, and California. Japan, a resource-poor island nation, had almost no domestic oil. They were entirely dependent on imports. The very reason they attacked Pearl Harbor was to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies because the American embargo was strangling them. Yamamoto knew that you cannot invade a continent that sits on an ocean of oil when your own tanks are running on fumes, but it wasn't just the raw materials. It was what the Americans did with them. Yamamoto tried to explain to the high command that the American genius was mass production. The Japanese Zero fighter was a masterpiece of engineering, hand-built by master craftsmen, elegant, agile, and beautiful. But it took months to build. The Americans, they didn't build works of art, they built machines of war, and they built them like they built Fords. When the sleeping giant awoke, the transformation was absolute. The Ford Motor Company, which had put the world on wheels, stopped making cars and started making death. They built a factory at Willow Run that was a mile long. The engineers said it was impossible. But by the peak of the war, that single factory was churning out a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 60 minutes. Think about that for a second. Every single hour, 24 hours a day, a 4-engine monster rolled off the line, ready to fly. While Japan celebrated the construction of a single new aircraft carrier as a national triumph that took years of labor, American shipyards, led by industrialists like Henry Kaiser, were applying assembly line techniques to shipbuilding. They were welding ships together like Lego blocks. They brought the production time of a Liberty ship down from months to weeks, and then to days. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was built from the keel up and launched in 4 days and 15 hours. This was the industrial tsunami that Yamamoto foresaw. He knew that for every ship he sank at Pearl Harbor, the American furnaces would forge 2 more for every plane shot down. The factories in Michigan would spit out 10 to replace it. He told the Prime Minister famously, "I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, but after that, I have utterly no confidence in our ultimate victory." He said this because he knew the math. He knew that an invasion of the U.S. mainland would face an enemy that could rearm itself instantly. An invading Japanese army would have a finite supply of bullets and bombs, dragged across 5,000 miles of ocean. The American defenders would have an infinite supply pipe delivered by the finest rail network on Earth, straight from the factory floor to the front line. The Japanese hoped to break the American morale with a sharp blow, but instead they activated a production capacity that dwarfed the entire Axis alliance combined. Yamamoto realized that the sleeping giant wasn't just the soldiers, it was the Rosie the riveters, the engineers, the miners, and the machinists. It was a system designed to overwhelm the enemy, not with skill, but with sheer brute, suffocating weight of metal and fire. This was the third impossibility. You cannot invade a nation that can build a brand new air force every month. You cannot conquer a people who can turn a car factory into a bomber plant in 90 days. Yamamoto knew that once the gears of American industry started turning, the war was no longer a contest of strategy. It was a countdown to Japan's inevitable destruction. And so, we arrive at the final tragic chapter of this saga, a chapter that reveals a dark mirror image of Yamamoto's warning. By 1945, the roles had reversed. The sleeping giant had not only awakened, it had crossed the ocean, island by bloody island, and was now standing at the gates of Japan. The United States Navy, which Yamamoto had hoped to demoralize, was now the largest armada in the history of the world. Blotting out the horizon off the coast of Okinawa, the American planners began to draw up the blueprints for the final invasion of the Japanese home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall. And as they looked at the maps and calculated the cost, they ran into the exact same wall of terror that Yamamoto had foreseen 4 years earlier. The Japanese High Command, having lost their navy, having lost their air force, and having lost the war, decided to play their final card. They decided to enact the very strategy that Yamamoto had warned made America unconquerable. They decided to mobilize the population. The plan was called Ketsugo, or Decisive Operation. It was a plan for national suicide on a continental scale. The Japanese government passed the Volunteer Military Service Law, effectively drafting every man from 15 to 60 and every woman from 17 to 40 into the Patriotic Citizens Fighting Corps. They didn't have 50 million rifles like the Americans, so they improvised. They mobilized high school girls and taught them how to charge with bamboo spears. They gave farmers satchel charges to throw under American tanks. They instructed children on how to become suicide bombers. The propaganda slogan was, "The glorious death of 100 million." This was the ultimate bitter irony. The Japanese generals, who had deemed an invasion of America impossible because of the stubborn resistance of the armed American civilian, were now banking their entire survival on becoming that very thing. They turned their entire nation into a rifle behind every blade of grass, or rather a spear behind every rice stalk. When American intelligence began to intercept these plans, the estimates for Operation Downfall became apocalyptic. General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz looked at the fanaticism displayed at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese soldiers fought to the last man and civilians chose suicide over surrender, and they extrapolated that horror to the main islands. The Pentagon ordered the production of 500,000 Purple Heart medals, anticipating a slaughter of American troops that would rival the entire Civil War. Casualties for the Allies were estimated at over 1 million. Japanese casualties were estimated in the tens of millions. It would have been the annihilation of a culture. And this brings us to the decision that changed the world. President Harry S. Truman was presented with a choice that was not really a choice, but a calculation of horror. On one hand, he could order Operation Downfall, sending 1 million American boys into a meat grinder against a radicalized population, fulfilling Yamamoto's prophecy of a never-ending guerrilla war. On the other hand, he had a new, terrible weapon, a weapon born from that same American industrial might that Yamamoto had feared, the atomic bomb. The decision to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was ultimately a decision to avoid the invasion. It was the only way to break the will of the Japanese High Command without having to fight every single civilian on the ground in a terrifying way. Yamamoto was right. until the very end. He was right that a conventional invasion of a determined, mobilized nation is impossible. He was right that the cost in blood would be too high for any democracy to stomach. The only thing he didn't foresee was that the American giant would find a way to end the war without stepping foot on the beaches until the surrender was signed. He didn't foresee the sun being brought down to earth. Yamamoto died in 1943, shot down over the jungle by American P-38 Lightnings, victims of the very code-breaking and industrial superiority he warned about. He didn't live to see the mushroom clouds, but his legacy remains in the silence of the invasion that never happened, the story of why Japan never invaded America, and why America ultimately didn't have to invade Japan, is a lesson in the power of the human element in war. It teaches us that maps and tanks and ships are only part of the equation. The true strength of a nation lies in its people, in their will to resist, in their capacity to produce, and in the terrifying resolve that lies dormant until it is awakened. History tells us that the United States was saved not just by the Pacific Ocean, but by the hardware stores in Montana, the factories in Detroit, and the rifle behind every blade of grass. It is a reminder that the greatest deterrent to tyranny is a free people who refuse to be conquered. Thank you for watching this deep dive into history. If you believe that these stories matter, if you want to keep the memory of the past alive so we don't repeat its mistakes, please subscribe to the channel and share this video. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.